Obviously, in today's climate, words like diversity and inclusivity are more important than ever before, both within the context of internal culture at organizations, and then how that shows up for their consumers. So I am very excited to be joined by Ezinne Okoro from Wunderman Thompson, who will help me touch on some of these topics and share some best practices for how this all comes to life within an organization, and how that shows up ultimately for everyone, consumers as well. So Ezinne, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm well. Good to see you, Scott. And thanks for everyone for joining and listening to this very important conversation that we're going to have today.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to have it. So let's start by talking about your current job title, which is Global Chief Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity Officer. Number one, that is an incredible job title. I'm very jealous. Talk to me a little bit about what the core responsibilities are of that role.
I know it's such, whenever I hear the title myself, I'm like, whoa, is this me? It's definitely a big title, and it comes with a huge responsibility, I think, just for the agency, for the employees, and really for the industry as well, too. So I take it very seriously and with complete humility to be able to lead such an effort for such a large organization. And really, and the funny, ironic thing is, I'm actually not really into titles. I'm the person that's kind of like completely like throw the ego out the door. Anyone can talk to me. Like, it's just kind of like, how can we relate and how can I support you in your experience? But really, at the core, my role is to support the business in actualizing their goals for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And really, what does that mean is, how do they make sure that they are attracting and retaining top talent from diverse backgrounds? How are they showing up for their clients and their clients' customers when we're talking about creative technology, communications, et cetera, and truly supporting the executive team and making sure that they're creating an equitable space for everyone that works with them. I mean, I think that there's two things that are really important to any organization. It's your people and it's your revenue. And the interesting thing is, you can't have one without the other. So as we're focusing on business strategy and how to be sustainable and how to bring profits in and how to continue to be continue to grow, it's the same thing from the people perspective. How do you continue to get the best of the best? And that's what diversity and inclusion and equity is all about. It's really getting the best of the best, keeping them, and making sure everyone has a sense of belonging in that space. So really the role, as much as I'm the one leading it, everyone is part of that journey, and everyone has a voice in it, and everyone is just as responsible as I am. I just happen to be the face of the change, really.
That's amazing, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I also would imagine, based on the way that you're sort of talking about the role, that your work is directly shaping the sort of makeup of the organization, and I would imagine that either indirectly or directly impacts the work that the external outputs of the agency. Are you vetting that work, or is that just through the actual makeup of the organization, that therefore there's an expectation that
I think in the perfect world, especially with my personality, I would love to vet every single project and that piece of work that we're doing, right? But the reality is, one person cannot be the person responsible to doing that. So the way that I come in is, I am supporting the team with tools and a framework, and really identifying, giving them the ability to identify certain blind spots, and enhancing their ways of working to make sure that they're always thinking about what's missing, what are we not addressing, or are we amplifying a particular stereotype that we don't want to? How is this going to connect to someone that does not look like me? How does this connect to maybe my target audience, but even broader than that? Because always the goal is always to bring in a new audience, right? So really the way that I'm supporting them in doing that is to make sure that one, they have a confidant, they have someone that they can come to if they're really struggling and challenging and just not really sure where to place things. And then two, making sure that they have the skill set and the toolkits in order to go forward. So I think, like I mentioned before, the work is not singular, right? It's not just stuck in one department or one individual. In order for it to truly be sustainable, we all have to take a role in it. So for me, success looks like is when someone, let's say, Scott, you were creating something and you're like, you know what? I think this is good, but I'm not 100% sure. So let me just double check with Ezinne and her team. And that's what I want. I want you to have that. Let me just double check, right? Let me just make sure so that what we can now say is, well, we had a diverse group of people to look at this project and we feel comfortable. And the reality though is you're not always going to get it 100% right. But if the process in place makes sense, and you're doing your due diligence, you have a higher chance if you do calculated risk, right? You have a higher chance of landing it perfectly than you do of creating something that will be harmful to yourself, to the business, or to your teams later on.
Awesome. I love that sort of notion of, like you were saying, the sort of framework or process in place in order to sort of make sure that you're at least going through the proper steps, and ideally you're going to come out with the best result. And then also the fact that you're sort of creating this ownership culture where people feel that they are, have a role, and then can also, elevate that, or have that sort of bigger conversation.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. I never want someone to feel like I am the start and the end to anything related to inclusion, equity, and diversity, right? I happen to be the person that is leading and driving it. But if I decide to leave tomorrow, the work still needs to be carried forward, right? And change is about, like, I didn't, like if you think about culture, you didn't build the culture by yourself. I didn't build the culture by myself. So in order for us to change the culture, we all have to be part of that equation.
So, just taking a step back and looking at the landscape a little bit. I mean, obviously, it's, we're fresh into 2021. Where are agencies and, just sort of big organizations in their sort of journey to addressing, these big issues: diversity, equity, inclusion? Why now is that sort of happening?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is, and you kind of mentioned it when we first started the conversation, inclusion, equity, and diversity has been a topic for decades. It's not something that just started in May 25th, 2020, right? It's something that has really been at the forefront and in conversation. I think what was particularly unique, coming 2020 into 2021 is the recent of racial injustice and the fight for equality, specifically as a result and as a result of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. And I think we are doing ourselves a disservice if we don't call those names whenever we have these conversations, especially around this time. And the reason why I specifically cited May 25th is actually that is when that shift happened. And so, I think what we learned from that is we were forced to be home. We were forced to be present. We were forced to kind of watch what was going on in the world because of the global health pandemic. And I think that that's what made people uniquely aware of what was going on in the world. But it's always been going on in the world. And I'm saying that as a Black woman, like it's always been going on. So I think what I appreciate about this is that now there's no more excuses. We have to do right. we have to make sure we push the envelope so that we don't go 10 years from now again and be like, oh, wow, diversity and inclusion and equity is still a hot topic. It shouldn't be. It should just be a normal part of the business, the same way that we think about marketing, communications, finance, et cetera. It's like, what does your culture look like in your business? And how do you provide equity for those that are underrepresented? And when I think about the advertising industry specifically, advertisers they're the ones that are creating what we see. So the task for them is even bigger and larger. And I always, I'm new to the advertising industry, and I always be thinking about the pressure of creating something that you don't want to be in the media for something negative, right? You want it to be about positivity and inspiration and ambition. So the weight that they have on their shoulders as well, which is why it's even so much more critical for us in this industry to do it right, because we are often the ones that are changing the narrative. And if I can just give a quick example, at Wunderman Thompson, we recently did an amazing campaign for Avon called This Is My Color. And it was all about breaking the myths of what beauty looks like, and especially on darker skin tones. And it, was a whole song, and it was a whole mantra, and it really created a lot of attention, because what it did is that it single-handedly started to shift to say, you know what, I love my color. I see makeup lines that resonate to me. And you have young girls as small as the age of 3 and 4 and 5 years old that see people that look like them that says, I am beautiful, right? So advertisers, we have such a responsibility to make sure we put those type of stories forward.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about it in those terms, and just the fact of, being a consumer and feeling represented, and how that sort of begins to shift the cultural conversation, not just for individuals, but just on a larger scale. Yeah. So it makes sense that, especially anyone, whether it's in marketing agencies or just like organizations in general, it's so important for them to have that as a mandate, I suppose. So from a best practices point of view, obviously we have a bunch of folks in the audience who are from agencies, who are from retailers, who are from brands. What are some of the things that any organization should be doing as they think about advancing, some of these ideas of, equity and inclusivity, and even like bringing transparency and accountability into play? Like, maybe just a few ideas that you have for them.
Yeah. Scott, what's interesting is I actually struggle sometimes with the word best practices when it comes to inclusion, equity, and diversity. And I know there's several people that would debate on me with this, but if you can hear me out, I think for me, what happens is, I feel like sometimes if you use that term, it doesn't feel authentic. It doesn't feel genuine, right? It kind of feels like, okay, well, we're trying to check off a box to make sure that we're doing something right and that everyone is going to agree with it. And that's not really the reality. The reality that it's such a heart and brain activity that, yes, there are baseline things that I will provide in a second, but a part of it too is also understanding your organization and your team and where you are and how you sit in. There's some that are going to be like, have absolutely zero. We barely even say whatever, like we barely, we have like zero representation of the LGBTQ plus community, or we're barely comfortable saying disability, whatever it may be. And then you have those that are actively changing and have 50% equity, et cetera, et cetera. So to use and I guarantee that the process for both is very different. So I think using best practices can be a little bit challenging, but I do think what companies can start off with, very, very baseline, anyone can do it. I don't care if you have $0 in your budget, is a journey of just self-awareness. Really take an inventory to understand, okay, where the hell are we? Like, let's look around the room, let's look at our data. Let's be honest with ourselves as to where we are. And that type of self-reflection go such a long way, because it opens up your eyes to like, oh, wow, I really thought we were doing an amazing job, but I see that we're falling short. And when you're able to identify that and say that and be honest with yourself and your executive team about that, then the real work goes on, right? Because then if someone comes in, whether it's myself or a consultant, et cetera, and say, I don't agree with this, we need to change this, let's enhance this, let's take this out, you're not startled because you've already did the initial step to understand, you know what, we're really not where we need to be. So the first thing I would say is reflection. The second thing is awareness, is really taking inventory as to what is the noise and the climate in your company. And that's, a lot of people use focus groups, they use listening tours. I think it's so important and amazing for CEOs to be part of that. And I know that they're getting their time can be very challenging. But if your CEO or someone in your executive team can at least be in a couple of those sessions, it lands so incredibly well, and they become so invested because people are sharing their personal stories on how they're lacking equity in their business. And no CEO wants to hear that. They don't want to hear that their employee doesn't want to be here. They don't want to hear that. So I think reflection, awareness, and then start to figure out what's the plan. And that plan of it, which we can call best practice, or we can call your strategy, your framework, your tools, that's going to take longer to do. That's a very fluid process. It will change. Things will move around because of where you initially are. But I do think it's so powerful when we just take the time to say, well, you know what, like, I have a problem. We have a problem and we need to solve it. Just do that. And that's going to take a long way. And then your employees are going to appreciate that honesty, that transparency, and then they're going to hold you accountable to that information.
That's amazing. And I think that makes total sense, understanding that it's going to be different for every organization, but starting from that place of being open to change, number one, and then recognizing that it's an ongoing process that's going to continually be changing, I think as well, is extremely important. So that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I guess one last question is, we've focused a lot on thinking about sort of internal culture and what that means for organizations themselves. Obviously, within the advertising agency world or within the retail world, there's a lot of that, actually going out and showing up for consumers and communities. And so often, obviously, that's depending on how an organization approaches that, it can fall flat or it cannot feel authentic.
Yeah.
What are some of the ways that organizations can create sort of these positive changes in a way that is actually helpful?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that that's such a, it's always an interesting conversation, because I think companies want to do well and they want people to know that they're doing well, because they want the customers, they want the clients, they want the recognition, rightfully so. I think in making sure that it feels super genuine is really making sure that in-house they also know what you're doing and what you stand for. Because I think a lot of times companies forget your employees are your ambassadors first, right? They are your first ambassadors. They're your first champions. They're your first customers. They're your first clients. So it's really important that they buy in to the strategy, to the commitment, to your transparency. And then when you are now taking something externally facing, or you're making a statement. I think a lot of companies made statements for Black Lives Matter, and some of them got the backlash from it. And they got the backlash because in-house, their employees were like, I've never believed this. Like, where did this come from? We've never even mentioned anything regarding race or equality or anything. And that's the downfall that I think a lot of companies make, is that big mistake where they're really quick to pull the trigger when it comes to the external facing things, and need to make sure that they recognize what's going on internally. And your employees, trust me, if you're doing things the right way, when you release statements such as that, or how I mentioned the campaign for Avon, they will rally behind it so quickly. And then that word of mouth spreading information, which is what we love, because that's how you organically spread messaging, it will just happen so naturally, right? So I think that it's really important to make sure that if you're sending out a press release or a whatever it is, figure out a way to kind of socialize that internally and say, we are super proud of this project. We are super proud of this partnership. You can learn more information here. And then boom, the next morning it happens to be external. And I'm saying that specifically by experience as well too, because I remember a couple of years ago, I was pulling the trigger very quickly on external projects. And I would have employees come to me and say, it would be really great if we knew that that was happening because we would love to support it. And I'm like, you know what? You're right. Like you're absolutely right. So thank you for sharing that with me. And I'm like committed to making sure that we find avenues to make sure that we share so that we can bring our champions and ambassadors with us too, because your employees are your biggest assets.
That's amazing. And I think that's a great way to end the conversation, is again, like thinking about that sort of the flow of that voice sort of working both directions and the importance of that within the organization. And I love that idea of making your employees feel like they are empowered and that they're, you know, can speak on behalf of the company, obviously in the right ways and
Right.
etc. But
Yeah.
that's fantastic. Well, Ezinne, thank you so much. This has been a very enlightening conversation for me, and I hope for the audience as well. Good luck to you in 2021 and beyond. You have a big job, and I know it seems like you are well equipped to handle. So thanks so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everyone for tuning in. You know, and like I tell everyone, regardless of whatever your title is, your contribution to creating a space of inclusion, equity, and diversity is critical and is warranted and is welcomed. So please continue to utilize your voice and for change.
Awesome. Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.
Have a good one.
Okay.